The flashlight beam hit the wall. Lucas swept it left, then right. The basement smelled of wet ash and something older, grease soaked into stone over decades. The fire upstairs had been out for 2 hours. The structure wasn't going anywhere. He'd told the team that when they'd packed up and left, and he'd told himself he was staying to walk the perimeter. He didn't look too hard at why that felt like a lie. The right wall had buckled inward. A beam had come down across the stairs, and the ceiling beyond it was open to the sky, or what passed for sky at 4 a.m. over this part of the city, which was the color of old copper and smelled the same. He moved the beam along the floor. Ash. Pooled water from the hoses. A broken pallet. Rat droppings older than the fire. His boots left prints in the gray slick of it, each step deliberate, unhurried. He'd walked burned buildings since he was 22. You learned not to rush. The floor that looked solid was sometimes the one that gave. He almost missed them. The light caught a reflection. Amber, low, close to the ground. Animal was his first thought, purely automatic, before his brain caught up and told him it was eyes. A person. 2 people. Something smaller between them. He stopped. His hand didn't tighten on the flashlight. That reflex had burned out of him long ago, replaced by something flatter and more useful. He just went still and waited to understand what he was seeing. The orc was a woman. She was sitting with her back against the far wall, one arm wrapped around a child, a boy, small, maybe 5, with a shock of black hair, and her other hand pressed flat over his mouth, not rough, just firm. The child wasn't struggling. He was watching Lucas with gray eyes that had already learned to be quiet. The woman's honey-colored eyes didn't move from Lucas's face. She wasn't hiding anymore. She'd been found, and she knew it. And she was waiting. That was the part that landed somewhere behind his sternum. Not the hiding, but the waiting. The particular kind of stillness that comes from expecting the worst and deciding not to flinch when it arrives. Behind her, half folded into the shadow of a fallen shelf, was a second orc. Younger. Taller, even sitting. Her hair was cut short and uneven, like someone had taken a knife to it in a hurry, and she had a scar on her right cheek, a curved comma of raised skin. She was watching Lucas too, but differently. Her jaw was working like she was chewing on words, deciding whether to let them out. Lucas moved the flashlight beam down. The woman's left shoulder was wrong. The sleeve of her overalls had been torn away, and whatever was underneath, the skin, the tissue, was raw and pale pink in a way that meant it was newer than the fire last night. He could see the shape of it, shoulder to shoulder blade, the kind of burn you got from a flash, from something catching and spreading faster than you could turn away from it. She hadn't flinched when the light hit it. He wasn't sure if that was discipline, or if she'd been sitting in that cold basement long enough that the pain had leveled out into something she'd stopped noticing. He took his coat off. The green canvas was scorched at the hem, as it always was by the end of a long night, and it was damp from the hoses, and it smelled like every fire it had been through in 3 years of service. He held it out. She didn't move. Her eyes tracked the coat, then came back to his face, and the math she was doing behind them was visible. Not in any expression, exactly, but in the quality of the stillness. What does he want for this? What does this cost? He didn't say anything. He just held it out until she reached for it, one-handed, slow, pulling it across her chest and the child, and not quite putting it on, just holding it there. The small boy watched this happen without changing his expression at all. Lucas looked at the younger one in the shadow. She'd finally decided to let the words out. He could see her take a breath, and he spoke first, quietly, before she could. The exit is through the right wall. There's a passage through to my station. I'll go first." He turned and walked back toward the buckled wall without waiting to see what they'd do with that information. His flashlight lit the floor ahead of him. The passage was low. You had to duck through, and it opened into the side yard of the station, where the drainage grate was, and the smell of grease was always stronger than everything else. He stood at the threshold and listened. Footsteps. 3 sets. The child's were almost silent. He stepped through and didn't look back, just kept moving, because he'd found that people followed better when you weren't watching them to see if they would. The station's side door was unlocked. He pushed it open and held it. They came through without touching him, the woman first, still clutching his coat, the boy attached to her side, the younger one last. She glanced at him as she passed. She looked like she was right on the edge of saying something. He gave her the smallest headshake. Not now. And she swallowed whatever it was and kept moving. He let the door close behind them, turned the interior bolt, and stood in the dark of the equipment corridor and listened to the building around him. Nothing moved. The team was gone. The building held its usual smells: grease, old smoke, the mineral sharpness of the stone walls. He let the breath out of his chest and didn't examine what he'd just done, because it was late, and his shoulder ached from 6 hours on hoses, and the woman with the burn was standing in his station. He pointed toward the back room. She looked at the door, then at him, then walked. The back room wasn't much. A metal cot with a folded blanket nobody used. A shelf of spare parts for the pump gear, half of them obsolete. A stove, cast iron, older than the station, vented through the wall, with a small pile of split wood beside it that Lucas kept there for nights when the heating gave out, which it did every February without fail. A single lamp hung on a cord from the ceiling. He lit it first, then crouched at the stove and got a fire going with the efficiency of someone who didn't have to think about the steps anymore. Tinder, kindling, 1 match. The iron ticked as it warmed. He didn't look at them while he did it. He heard them settle, the rustle of canvas, the soft, specific weight of a child being set down on something, and he kept his attention on the stove until the wood caught and stayed. Then he stood, went to the cabinet above the shelf, and found the kit he kept there: rolled gauze, a bottle of saline, a small tin of drawing salve the medic had left after the last inspection. He set them on the cot beside the woman and pulled the stool over and sat. She was still holding his coat across her chest. The burn on her shoulder was exposed on the left side. She'd arranged it that way without him asking, which meant she'd already decided to let him look, even if she hadn't decided anything else. Her honey-colored eyes were on his hands, not on his face, just his hands. Lucas had noticed that before in people who'd learned that faces lied, that you watched the hands, because hands told you what was actually coming. He opened the saline and soaked a piece of gauze. "This'll sting," he said. She didn't answer. He worked slowly, the way you worked around a burn when you weren't sure of the depth. Light pressure, no friction, just cleaning the surface. She was quiet through all of it. Not stiff with the effort of it, just contained. Her other hand, the one on the boy's shoulder, stayed steady. The boy was sitting beside her with his knees pulled up and his gray eyes fixed on the orange glow coming through the stove grate. He looked like he'd been watching fires through grates for long enough that this one was just another. 2 years ago, Lucas looked up. The younger one was speaking. She was leaning against the wall near the door with her arms crossed. Canvas jacket, boots that didn't match, a bunch of small keys at her throat. And she was watching him work with an expression caught somewhere between suspicion and something that might have been relief trying to disguise itself. Her voice came quickly, like she'd built up pressure, and the words needed somewhere to go. "We worked at Halleck's plant, on the east side, the one that burned." Sarah was shift supervisor for the mechanical team. I was on shift 2. 6 of us from our brigade were in the workshop when it went up. She paused. 3 got out. Lucas kept working. He already knew about Halleck's plant. Everyone who'd responded to that fire knew, even the ones who hadn't been on shift that night. Especially those. He pressed the gauze flat against the edges of the burn, where the tissue was starting to granulate, already healing, already closed at the margins, and applied the salve and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything useful to say about a fire 2 years dead and the people who hadn't gotten out of it. "She pulled me," Sarah said. It was the first thing she'd said since the basement. Her voice was even, dry, like she was relaying information rather than a memory. She was still looking at his hands. She pulled me out of the workshop. I don't know how. She's not—" a breath. "She's not as strong as she looks." "I'm strong enough," Yi said from the wall. Her jaw lifted. "I'm extremely strong." "Incredibly. You're very welcome." The boy almost smiled. It came and went so quickly Lucas couldn't be sure he'd seen it. He secured the gauze with 2 strips of tape and sat back. The shoulder wasn't infected. He'd checked for that first before anything else. And the burn itself was 2nd degree at its worst, already past the stage where it needed anything he didn't have. It needed time, mostly. Clean dressing, kept dry. He said so, briefly, and Sarah nodded once, which was the only response he was going to get. And he took the response and stood. He went to the shelf near the stove where the kettle sat. Filled it from the tap in the corner. The back room had 1 tap, cold only, a detail he'd always found more useful than the station's architects had probably intended, and set it on the stove. While it heated, he stayed on his feet, because the room had 1 stool, and the cot, and the floor, and he'd already used the stool, and he wasn't going to make a point of where he stood in his own space. Yi was still talking. She'd moved from the wall to the floor, sitting cross-legged now with her back against the shelf, and she'd apparently decided that since the situation was what it was, she might as well inventory it aloud. She talked about the basement, how they'd found the passage from the old drain tunnel, how they'd been in there since before the fire went up, how Sarah had known the structure was sound enough to hold. She talked fast, and not always in a straight line, and she stopped at odd moments to glance at Sarah, checking something, before picking up the thread again. It wasn't nervousness exactly, or it was, but it was the kind of nervousness that had learned to wear a talkative coat. Lucas poured hot water into 3 mugs. They were the station mugs, chipped enamel, identical, and set 2 on the cot near Sarah, and crouched in front of the boy and held the 3rd out. The boy looked at it, then looked at Lucas, then looked at the mug again. Lucas held it steady. The boy reached out with both hands, both small, bright green, with ash still in the creases of his knuckles, and wrapped them around the enamel and pulled it carefully to his chest. He held it the way you held something you weren't sure you'd get to keep. Lucas stood. Yi had gone quiet for the first time. She was watching the boy with an expression that was trying not to be anything in particular and not quite managing. Sarah had her eyes on the stove. The iron ticked. The wood shifted. Outside, somewhere above the roofline, the city was beginning its slow argument with dawn. The first gray sound of it, carts on cobblestones, a factory whistle 3 streets over starting its shift. In here, the lamp burned steadily on its cord, and the 3 of them held their warmth like it was borrowed, which it was. Lucas pulled his coat from Sarah's hands, gently, no resistance, and hung it on the hook behind the door. Then he sat on the floor with his back against the wall, stretched his legs out, and looked at the ceiling. He was tired in the specific, clean way you got tired after a long fire, when the adrenaline had burned all the way down to the bottom and left nothing but weight. His shoulder ached. The gauze strips on Sarah's burn would hold through morning. The boy's hands were wrapped around the mug. He closed his eyes, not sleeping, just giving them the room. He woke to the sound of the gate. Not the main gate, The side one. The one the team used when they came back from a call and didn't want to drag the full rig through the arch. It had a specific sound. A scrape, then a clang, then boots on the yardstones in a particular rhythm. Lucas knew that rhythm the way he knew his own heartbeat. He was on his feet before his eyes were fully open. The back room was dim. The stove had burned down to coals. Sarah was on the cot, sitting, not lying, her back straight against the wall, with Pest asleep across her lap, his cheek pressed to her knee and his hand still curled around the empty mug. She'd covered him with the folded blanket from the foot of the cot. Yi was on the floor near the shelf, also asleep, her head tipped back and her mouth slightly open, and the bunch of keys at her throat catching the last of the stove's glow. She'd been talking when Lucas had drifted off. He hadn't noticed the moment she'd stopped. Sarah was watching him. She'd been awake then, or had woken when he did. Her eyes tracked him across the room. He put one finger up, wait, and she held his gaze for a moment like she was measuring the word, then looked down at the boy in her lap and didn't move. Lucas pulled the door closed behind him and crossed the equipment corridor in 4 steps, reaching the main floor just as the side door opened and the first of them came through. Doran first, carrying his helmet by the strap. Then Mace, who smelled like he always smelled after a night call, smoke and the particular sweat of sustained effort. Then Ron, last, pulling the door shut and turning the latch. They'd been at a warehouse fire on the far side of the district. A smaller one, called in at midnight, wrapped up before 4. Lucas could see it on them. The particular slump of a job that had been work, but not crisis, draining without being harrowing. Doran dropped into the chair by the board and put his helmet on the table and rubbed his face with both hands. Mace went straight to the kitchen alcove. Ron stood in the middle of the floor and looked around the station the way he always did when he came back to it. A slow, quiet survey, like he was taking inventory of what had changed in his absence. Ron was like that. He didn't miss things. "You stayed," he said, not a question. "Walked the perimeter on the warehouse site," Lucas said. "Structure was holding, but I wanted to be sure." All of that was true. He let it sit there on its own, without addition. Ron nodded once. He pulled off his gloves and tucked them in his belt. He was a broad man, Ron. Not tall, but built in the way that suggested his body had simply decided at some point not to waste space. And he had a face that gave very little away, which Lucas had always respected. He'd worked with him for 4 years. He trusted him in the way you trusted someone whose habits you understood completely, which was a specific and limited kind of trust, but real. Mace was clattering in the kitchen alcove, indifferent to everything. Doran had closed his eyes in the chair. Ron moved toward the equipment wall to hang up his coat, and Lucas tracked him in his periphery and kept his own posture still, one shoulder against the column, arms loose. Ron stopped. He was looking at the floor near the passage to the back corridor. Lucas didn't follow his gaze immediately. He knew what was there. The ash on the floor of the back corridor was thicker than it should be. The station floor tracked fine ash from every call, ground into the stone, impossible to fully clear. But near the corridor entrance it was disturbed. Small prints, overlapping. A child's, a woman's, and the long, narrow track of Yi's boots, which were a different size from each other and left a distinctive pattern. Ron crouched. He looked at the prints. He didn't touch them. He stayed down for a long moment, still and quiet, his thick forearms resting on his knees. Then he looked up at Lucas. Lucas looked back. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't adjust anything about his expression. He just held Ron's gaze and let the silence be what it was. Ron looked at the prince again. He stayed crouched for another breath. Then he stood, slowly, with the deliberate movement of a man whose knees had been through too many cold nights on stone floors, and turned to his coat on the hook and made a small adjustment to the way it hung, straightening it, a thing it didn't need, and said, without turning around, "I'm going to get some sleep before the morning inspection." He walked to the bunk room. His boots were even on the floor. The door closed. Lucas let the breath out through his nose and didn't move for another moment. Mace had found the kettle. Doran was already snoring in the chair. The station settled back into its ordinary sounds. The hiss of the gas ring in the alcove, the distant first shift whistle from somewhere east, the tick of the stone walls contracting in the morning cold. He waited until Mace had taken his tea to the bunk room and the main floor was empty. Then he went back down the corridor and opened the back room door. Sarah was still in the same position. Pest hadn't moved. Yi had come awake, or had never fully gone under, and was sitting with her back straight now, her dark eyes on the door. She opened her mouth. Lucas held up the same finger as before. She closed it. He pulled the door to and stood against the frame. Through the high, small window above the shelf, the sky was going from black to gray, the slow way it did in this part of the city, filtered through smoke and chimney haze until daylight arrived less like dawn and more like a gradual relenting. Somewhere in the building, a pipe knocked. The coals in the stove were still orange at the center. Pest stirred. He turned his face into Sarah's knee and made a small sound, not quite a word, and was still again. Sarah's hand moved to the back of his head, brief, automatic, the touch of someone who'd been doing it long enough not to notice they were doing it. She'd found him in the fire, Lucas had gathered from Yi's talking the night before. Not her child, just a child. She'd simply come out of the smoke with him. He thought about that for a moment, and then stopped thinking about it, because the morning inspection was in 2 hours, and there were things that needed doing before then. And because some things didn't need to be thought about so much as just registered and held. He looked at Sarah. She was already looking at him. "I need to move you before 6, he said quietly. "There's a utility room off the yard. It's not on the inspection rotation. There's a lock on the inside." She looked at him for a long beat. Then she looked at Pest. Then back at him. "How long?" she said. "I don't know yet." She held his gaze, measuring again, and he got the sense that she was doing the same calculation she'd been doing since the basement, running the numbers on him, checking the math, not finding an error, but not fully trusting the answer either. He let her look. He wasn't going to give her a reason to trust him. That wasn't how it worked. She'd either decide or she wouldn't. She looked down at the boy. She shifted her weight and said quietly, "Yi, get up." Yi was already moving. The utility room had one advantage over the back room. The window faced the yard wall, not the street, and it was too high and too narrow to see through from outside. It had one disadvantage. It was smaller. A shelf of chemical canisters along one wall, a coiled hose on a hook, a drain in the center of the floor. Lucas brought the cot mattress through before the inspection and laid it against the far wall, and Yi had immediately sat on it cross-legged like she was claiming territory, and Pest had sat beside her and stared at the chemical canisters with the focused attention of a child who'd decided they were interesting. Sarah hadn't sat down. She stood near the door after Lucas pulled it to. He'd left it unlatched, just rested against the frame so she could open it from inside. And she stood with her arms at her sides and looked at the wall. Not at anything on it, just the wall. Lucas had noticed she did that sometimes. Went somewhere behind her eyes while her body stayed where it was. He'd come back after the inspection, when the team had filtered out for the afternoon shift change, and found her still standing. Yi had fallen asleep against the shelf with her head on her own shoulder. Pest was asleep on the mattress. Sarah had turned when the door opened, her hand moving toward her belt, toward where a tool would have hung if she'd had one, and stopped when she saw it was him. He brought food. Bread from the station kitchen, a tin of beans he'd heated on the gas ring, 2 more mugs of water. He set them on the shelf and sat on the upturned crate he'd brought in and said nothing, because there wasn't much to say that the food didn't already say better. She ate standing. She ate like someone who'd learned that meals were not guaranteed to last. Steadily, without waste, without the appearance of hunger, even though she was clearly hungry. Pest woke when he smelled the food and ate half a piece of bread with his eyes still mostly closed. Yi stayed asleep. It was in that quiet, beans, bread, the distant sound of the afternoon shift running the pump check in the yard, that Sarah said, "This is the same owner." Lucas looked up. She was looking at him now. Her honey-colored eyes were level. She spoke the way she did everything, without preamble, without hedging, just the fact set down in front of him like a tool on a workbench. "Halleck, the man who owned the plant 2 years ago, the one that burned. He's reopened. Different address, the warehouse district, North End. Different name and the company papers." She paused. "Same foreman, same shift structure, same storage arrangement for the accelerants." She said the last word without inflection, which made it land harder than if she'd pressed it. "We were working there. The warehouse that burned last night. That was his." Lucas put the mug down. He went back through the night, the call coming in at 11, the warehouse on Cutter Street. The way it had gone up faster than a warehouse full of dry goods had any reason to. The particular color of the smoke. He'd noted it and filed it, and been too tired by the time the fire was out to pull the file back open. He pulled it open now. "The violations," he said. "Same as before. Accelerants stored against the load-bearing wall. Sprinkler heads painted over. They don't trigger until the heat's already past the point where they matter. The alarm relay runs through the foreman's booth before it hits the city line." She said it all from memory, flat and sequential, the way you recited things you'd repeated to yourself enough times that they'd worn grooves. "I reported it before the first fire, to the city inspector, to the district labor board. I have the dates." She touched her forearm, a reflex, touching something that wasn't there. No one answered. Lucas was quiet for a moment. He thought about the plant owner 2 years ago, the one he'd sat across from in a district office while a city liaison explained that the investigation had found no evidence of deliberate negligence. He remembered the owner's hands on the table. Clean hands. The hands of someone who'd learned that cleanliness, in this city, was something you could purchase after the fact. "He'll do it again," Lucas said. "Yes. How long before it's operational, the new site?" She considered. "He was running partial shifts already. A week? Maybe less." Pest had finished his bread and was sitting with the empty mug between his palms again, turning it slowly. Yi stirred on the shelf and blinked and looked at the tin of beans and reached for it without comment. Sarah watched Lucas the way she'd been watching him since the basement, checking the math, looking for the error in it. He understood now what the math was. It wasn't about whether he'd turn them in, or kick them out, or use them for something. It was simpler than that, and harder. She'd handed him something. Information she'd been carrying for 2 years. Information that had cost her people and her livelihood, and a strip of skin from her shoulder. And she was watching to see what he did with the weight of it, whether he'd set it back down. He didn't set it back down. He looked at the wall, the same one she'd been looking at, and thought about Cutter Street and the smoke that had been the wrong color, and a man with clean hands in a district office. He thought about what it meant that the same structure had been rebuilt at a new address and filled back up with the same violations and the same painted-over sprinkler heads, and how many shifts would run before the next alarm, and whether the alarm relay would run through the foreman's booth again. "You said you have documents," he said. She hadn't said that yet. He saw her register the error, He'd gotten ahead of himself, ahead of the brief she was still constructing for him, and something shifted in her expression. Not suspicion, recalibration. He'd anticipated her. She was deciding what to do with that. "Not yet," she said. Quiet, level. "But yes." He nodded and picked up his mug and drank the rest of the water and stood. "Get some sleep," he said. "Both of you." Yi had already finished the beans. Pest had set the mug down and was lying on his side on the mattress with his eyes open, watching the chemical canisters with the same patient attention as before. Sarah watched Lucas go to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "The inspection foreman for this district," he said. "What was his name?" She told him. Lucas filed it alongside the color of the smoke and the shape of the burn on her shoulder and the clean hands in the district office, and walked back out into the station, where the afternoon shift was already running the hose check and the day smelled like grease and old stone and everything that was about to get complicated. He went in the morning, before the shift change. He wore the inspection coat, not his fire crew coat, the other one, the one that hung on the back of his locker with the district seal on the chest pocket. He'd earned the inspector's certification 3 years ago, after the Halleck fire, because he'd needed something that would let him walk into places and ask questions without anyone calling the foreman first. He hadn't used it much. He used it now. The new facility was on Cutter North, behind the grain storage buildings, in a block of warehouses that all looked like they'd been built cheap and maintained cheaper. The kind of block where the city inspector came twice a year and wrote the same report and filed it with the same office, and nothing changed, because nothing was meant to change. Lucas found the main entrance and showed his credential to the man at the gate, who looked at it and looked at Lucas and looked at it again, and then opened the gate without a word, because that was what the credential was for. The owner met him in the front office. His name was Aldrin Peck, though the company papers used a different name, a holding name, a shell, 2 removes from anything traceable. Lucas knew this because he'd spent the previous afternoon sitting on the floor of the back room with the station's district records open across his knees, while Sarah stood at the window and didn't help, and Yi read over his shoulder and occasionally said things like, "That one," and "No, the other column." Peck was a man of about 50, well-dressed in the way that cost money to look effortless, with gray at his temples and a handshake that arrived a half-second too quickly. The handshake of someone who'd learned that getting there first read as confidence. "Inspector Grain," he said. "We weren't expecting a visit." "Routine review," Lucas said, following up on the Cutter Street incident. Peck's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of change. "Terrible business. We had no connection to that property, of course. Different ownership entirely." "Of course." Lucas took out the inspection ledger and opened it. "I'll need to see the sprinkler certification, the accelerant storage log, and the alarm relay schematic." "Naturally." Peck gestured to a chair. "Can I offer you something while we wait for my clerk to pull the files?" Lucas sat. Peck sat across from him and crossed one leg over the other and smiled the way people smiled when they were managing a situation rather than participating in it. The office was warm. There was a painting on the wall behind Peck's desk, a landscape, mountains, somewhere that wasn't this city, and Lucas looked at it for a moment and thought about the painted-over sprinkler heads and how a coat of paint took about 4 minutes to apply per head, and who gave that order, and who carried it out, and who signed the work log afterward. The clerk brought the files. Lucas went through them slowly, the way he'd learned to go through documents, not looking for what was there, but for the shape of what wasn't. The accelerant log had entries, but the quantities didn't match the storage footprint he'd seen on the way in. The sprinkler certification was dated correctly, but the inspection company listed had dissolved 8 months ago. The alarm relay schematic showed a direct line to the city exchange, clean and simple, with no notation of the foreman's booth junction that Sarah had described, because Sarah had seen it with her own eyes in a building that no longer existed. He wrote in the ledger. He didn't write what he'd found. He wrote what he'd been told, because what he'd been told was on the record, and what he'd found was in his head, and he knew the difference between those two places and what each of them was worth. When he closed the ledger, Peck leaned forward slightly, just slightly. "I hope everything's in order," he said. "There are a few items I'll need to follow up on," Lucas said. "Standard procedure," Peck nodded. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a card and set it on the desk between them. It was a plain card, just a name and a number, no title, and the gesture was so practiced it had become invisible to the man making it. "If there's anything I can help clarify," he said, "please don't hesitate. We're very committed to full compliance here." Lucas looked at the card. He picked it up and put it in his breast pocket without looking at Peck again, and stood and thanked him for his time, and walked out through the front office, and past the clerk, and out the gate, and onto the street. He stood on the pavement for a moment. The block smelled like all industrial blocks smelled, metal and effluent, and the background note of smoke that never fully cleared from any street in this district. A cart went past, a woman with a market basket. Two men in work clothes eating from a shared paper at a doorstep, not talking. He thought about what Peck's card in his pocket meant. Not as a bribe. It was too oblique for that, too plausibly a simple professional courtesy. As a signal. As the beginning of a conversation that would never be direct, would never leave anything on paper, where the subject was, "I know what you found, and you know what I know, and we can both decide how this goes." He'd been in that conversation before. He'd ended it the same way he was going to end it now, which was by not continuing it. He took the card out and dropped it in the gutter and walked. The station was 20 minutes on foot. He walked it without taking the direct route. Habit, or something like habit, the residue of years of knowing that this part of the city had eyes that reported to owners rather than to anyone else. When he came through the side gate, the yard was quiet, the rig sitting still under the overhang, pigeons on the arch. He went in through the side door and down the corridor and stood in the kitchen alcove and didn't move for a moment. Then he went to the utility room and knocked twice, the knock he'd established the second day so they knew it was him, and pushed the door open. Yi was awake, sitting on the upturned crate. She took one look at his face and opened her mouth, and then, for once, closed it again without saying anything. Sarah was at the back wall. She turned. She read whatever was in his expression with the same efficiency she read everything, and she crossed the room to the shelf without a word and picked up the tin mug and filled it from the water canister and set it on the edge of the shelf in front of him. She didn't ask how it went. She didn't ask what he'd seen, or what Peck had said, or what he was going to do. She just put the mug there and stepped back and let him pick it up. And he picked it up and drank, and the water was cold and tasted like the canister, and it was exactly what he needed. Pest was on the mattress. He was drawing something on the stone floor with a piece of chalk Yi had found somewhere. A small figure, round-headed, with lines coming off it like rays. He didn't look up. There's something this story keeps returning to that I want to ask you directly. Sarah carried those documents for 2 years. 2 years of silence, of waiting, of watching the same machine rebuild itself at a new address. Have you ever held on to something that felt too heavy to carry and too important to put down? If you have, leave a comment. And if this story is landing somewhere in you, a like helps it reach the next person who might need it. Now, the door is about to open, and the man on the other side is not Lucas. The knock came at the main gate at midday. Lucas heard it from the equipment corridor. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, the knock of someone who'd practiced being official. He came through to the main floor and looked through the gate window before opening it. The man outside was alone. Mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that was trying to look municipal without quite committing. He had a leather satchel and a clipboard, and the particular expression of someone who'd been sent somewhere to find something specific and had been told to look like he was doing something else. Lucas opened the gate. "District Compliance Office," the man said. He produced a card. Lucas looked at it. It was a real card. The district seal, a registration number. But the compliance office didn't do unannounced facility checks on fire stations. That wasn't their mandate. Lucas knew their mandate because he'd spent enough time filing against it to know its exact shape. "What can I do for you?" Lucas said. "Routine review, following recent incident activity in the district." The man's eyes moved past Lucas into the main floor. A quick sweep, not the sweep of someone checking fire safety compliance, but of someone establishing what was in the room. "I'll need to see your equipment logs, shift records, and any temporary accommodation documentation." "Temporary accommodation," Lucas said. "Standard post-incident protocol. Any individuals or parties sheltered on station premises following emergency response." He said it smoothly, without emphasis, the way you said things you'd been given to say and had practiced until they stopped sounding like what they were. Lucas stepped back from the gate and let him in. He'd had time to prepare for this. Not much, but enough. He'd heard the knock and taken the 30 seconds between the window and the gate to decide how to play it. Not to prepare a lie. Lies required consistency under pressure, and pressure was exactly what this man had been sent to apply. Instead, the tour. The full tour, systematic and slow. Every door opened without hesitation. Every log produced and paged through. Every room accounted for. The station had 12 rooms. 11 of them contained exactly what they were supposed to contain. The tour would take as long as the tour needed to take, and at the end of it, the man would have seen 11 rooms opened without resistance, and would have to weigh that against asking about the 12th. "Equipment logs are in the boardroom," Lucas said. "I'll take you through chronologically." He took him through chronologically. The boardroom first. Shift logs, call records, equipment maintenance sheets. Lucas spread them on the table and answered questions without hurrying and without elaborating. The man made notes. His eyes moved to the doorways when he thought Lucas wasn't watching. Lucas was always watching. The gear room. Racks of coats, helmets, tool sets, the pump gear in the corner. The man walked the perimeter, clipboard angled, checking things that didn't need checking. Lucas stood at the door and let him walk. The kitchen alcove. The bunk room. Both bays, both sets of lockers. The man opened 2 of them and looked inside and found gear and personal items and nothing else. The washroom. The main bay where the rig sat. The yard. Lucas walked him around the entire perimeter. The drainage grate, the rig shed, the coal store. He opened every door. Every door except the one at the end of the yard corridor, which was the utility room, which he walked past at a pace that was exactly the pace he had maintained throughout, not faster, not slower, while pointing out the water pressure gauge on the yard wall and explaining the post-incident inspection protocol for the gauge seals. The man stopped. He looked at the door at the end of the corridor, then at Lucas. Lucas was looking at the pressure gauge. "What's through there?" the man said. "Storage," Lucas said. "Chemical canisters, overflow hose stock. It's not on the active equipment rotation." He made a small motion toward the gauge. "The seal date on this one is—" "I'll need to see it." Lucas looked at him. He let a beat pass, not long, just enough to be the beat of someone deciding whether to be inconvenienced. "It's locked from the inside for ventilation safety. I'll need to get the key from the boardroom." He gestured back the way they'd come. "If you want to wait here." The man considered this. Lucas watched him consider it and kept his face at the mild expression of someone whose afternoon had been disrupted, but who was committed to full compliance, and waited. On the other side of that door, in a room of about 12 square meters, Sarah was standing with Pesht held against her chest. Not sitting. Standing with her back against the shelf of canisters, her arms around the boy, her burned shoulder taking his weight without visible reaction. Yi was beside her, her back flat to the wall, one hand over her own mouth, not pressed hard, just resting there, a reminder. They'd heard the knock. They'd heard the gate. They'd had the same 30 seconds Lucas had, and they'd used them. Pest's face was in Sarah's neck. His eyes were open. He wasn't making a sound. The man was still looking at the door. Lucas waited with the patience of someone who had nothing to hide behind any of the doors in his station. The yard was quiet. A pigeon landed on the coal store roof and made its noise and left. "The boardroom," the man said finally. "Show me the incident reports from the last 30 days. Lucas turned and walked back toward the boardroom without changing his pace. He heard the man follow. He did not look at the utility room door. He spent 40 minutes on the incident reports. 30-day call log, response times, equipment sign-out sheets, the post-incident structural assessment from the Cutter Street fire. He answered every question. He made tea on the gas ring without being asked and set a mug in front of the man, who drank it, which told Lucas something about how long this man had been doing this kind of work and how tired he was of it. At the end of the 40 minutes, the man closed his satchel. He stood. He looked at Lucas with an expression that was trying not to be what it was, which was a man who knew he hadn't found what he'd been sent to find, and was calculating what that was going to cost him with whoever had sent him. "I may need to return for a follow-up review," he said. "We're here every day," Lucas said. He walked him to the gate and opened it and watched him go down the street until he turned the corner, and then stood at the gate for another moment, listening to the city go about its afternoon. Then he went back to the utility room and knocked twice and pushed the door open. Sarah was still standing. She'd lowered Pest to the floor, and he was sitting at her feet, leaning against her shin. Yi's hand had come down from her mouth. She was exhaling slowly through her nose, the deliberate exhale of someone who'd been holding everything very still for a very long time. Sarah looked at Lucas. The math in her eyes had shifted. Not resolved. She wasn't the kind of person whose math resolved quickly. But the variable had changed. He'd walked a man through 11 rooms and passed the 12th without hesitating. And she'd been on the other side of the door while he did it. And she knew exactly what that had required and what it had risked. And she was looking at him now with the expression of someone recalculating from a new position. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Pest looked up from the floor at Lucas. Then he reached out and picked up the chalk from beside the mattress and went back to his drawing on the stone. The round-headed figure from before, with the lines coming off it. He added a smaller figure beside it now. Same shape, same lines. Yi let out a breath that was almost a laugh, pressed it back, and sat down on the cot mattress with both hands over her face. The afternoon held them all in the small room, with the smell of chemical canisters and old stone. And the city went on outside the high window, and no one said anything about what had just happened, because there wasn't a word for it that was the right size. Part 7. He woke at 2 in the morning to an empty station. Not empty. Doran was in the bunk room, asleep. Ron, too, probably. But the main floor was dark, and the yard was quiet, and the particular quality of silence that settled over the station after midnight had settled. The kind where you could hear the building breathe. Lucas had been sleeping on the cot in the back room since the first night, giving the utility room to the 3 of them, and he lay there for a moment in the dark and counted the sounds. Duran's breathing through the wall, the tick of the stone, a cart somewhere 2 streets over. He counted 4 sounds. There should have been 5. He was out of the cot before he'd finished the thought. Down the corridor, past the boardroom, into the yard. The utility room door was closed. He tried it, unlocked the way he'd left it so they could open it from inside. He pushed it open. Yi was not on the mattress. Sarah was there, sitting up, already awake, already looking at him with an expression that told him she'd noticed the same absence and had been sitting with it for longer than she wanted to admit. "How long?" he said. She looked at the window. The sky through the high glass was the particular black of 2 in the morning, not yet thinning. "Not long," she said. Then, quieter, she couldn't sleep. Pest was curled beside her, deeply under, his chalk-dusty hand near his face. Lucas was already back in the corridor, already pulling his boots on, already going. He went out the side gate and turned right toward the block where the street opened up. Yi wouldn't have gone left. Left was the factory district. Too much activity, even at night. Too many of Peck's people moving between sites. Right was the residential edge. Narrower streets, less light. He moved quickly and didn't run because running at 2 in the morning drew attention, and attention was the problem they already had. He found her in the 3rd alley off the main street. She was backed against the wall, not cowering, nothing like that. She was standing with her shoulders square and her chin level, and there were 3 men in front of her. Work coats, heavy boots, the look of men who'd been given a task and had found it easier than expected. One of them was talking. Lucas couldn't hear the words from the alley entrance, but he could hear the tone, which was the tone of someone enjoying the distance between what they could do and what she could do about it. He took 3 steps into the alley and stopped. Yi was talking. He'd heard her talk before, the fast, pressured stream of it, the way she moved from subject to subject without apparent logic, but this was different. This was deliberate. She was talking directly to the man in front of her, looking at him with her dark eyes steady, and she was talking about him specifically. Not about the situation, not about herself, about him. His coat, which had a repair on the left elbow that suggested he'd had it a long time. The way he was standing, weight on the back foot, which she said meant he'd hurt his knee at some point and it hadn't healed right. She said it conversationally, without aggression, as if she were telling him something about himself he might find interesting. Then she moved to the man on the left, something about the calluses on his hands and what work made calluses in that particular place. Then the third. By the time Lucas had walked the length of the alley, the first man had taken half a step back. Not retreating, just repositioning. Yi hadn't raised her voice once. Lucas stopped beside her. He didn't touch her, didn't put himself between her and the men. She didn't need that, and it would have been the wrong signal. He just stood there, close enough that his shoulder was almost at her ear, and looked at the 3 men with the flat look he'd developed over years of walking into situations that were already burning. The men looked at him, then at each other. Then the one with the repaired elbow turned and walked out the far end of the alley, and the other 2 followed, and the sound of their boots faded into the street. Yi let out a breath. It was the first indication she'd given that any of that had cost her anything. Her hands, which had been still at her sides, moved. She pressed one to her sternum briefly, then let it drop. She was looking at the alley wall. "Are you hurt?" Lucas said. "No." A beat. "They didn't touch me." "Good." She turned to look at him. Her dark eyes were steady again, the wobble of the exhale already behind her. She studied his face for a moment, in the way she'd been studying things since the first night, taking an inventory, comparing it to something internal. Then she said, "How do you do it?" He looked at her. "Do what?" "That." She gestured vaguely toward the end of the alley where the men had gone. "You just stood there." And they left. Lucas thought about it. Not performing the thinking. actually going back through what had happened in the alley and what had been in his head during it, which was the man's weight on the back foot, the repair on the elbow coat, the specific calculation that men like that were not paid enough to take on a fire inspector who knew their faces. "I know who they are," he said. "They know it, too." Yi was quiet for a moment. She looked at the alley entrance. "I know who they are also," she said. "I just didn't know if knowing was enough." "Sometimes it isn't," Lucas said. Tonight it was. She nodded slowly. She was wrapping her arms around herself now. Not from cold, or not only from cold, and Lucas took his jacket off and held it out, and she looked at it with the same calculation Sarah had looked at his fire coat in the basement, the same instinctive inventory of cost and motive, and then took it and pulled it on over her canvas jacket. It was much too short on her. She looked down at the hem and then up at him with an expression that, in better circumstances, would have been the beginning of a joke. "Come on," he said. They walked back toward the station. Yi was quiet for most of it, which was unusual enough that Lucas let it be what it was. The streets were empty, the way they got after midnight in this part of the city, when the factory shifts had changed and the next ones hadn't started, and the streets belonged briefly to no one. Their footsteps were even on the stone. At the corner before the station, Yi said, "Sarah's going to be angry." "I know." "She's going to be very, very angry." "I know." A pause. "I'm glad you came," she said. Not to him, exactly. To the street, or to herself, in the slightly sideways way she said things that mattered. Then she pulled the jacket tighter around her and kept walking. At the station gate, Lucas stopped and looked back at the street they'd come from. It was empty. The lamp at the corner made a small pool of light on the cobblestones, and beyond it the dark was the dark of an industrial city at 2 in the morning, deep and indifferent, and full of things moving in it that never fully stopped moving. He stood there for a moment and felt the weight of the evening settle into his shoulders alongside everything else he was carrying. Then he opened the gate. Inside, in the utility room, Sarah was sitting with the same stillness she'd been sitting with when he'd left. Pest was still asleep. When Yi came through the door, Sarah looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that was doing a full inventory, checking for damage, running the same assessment Lucas had been trained to run on structures after a fire, finding nothing broken, letting the breath out through her nose. She didn't say anything. She looked at Yi and then looked away, which was, Lucas was beginning to understand, Sarah's version of pulling someone close. Yi sat on the mattress. She was still wearing Lucas's jacket. She pulled her knees up and put her chin on them and closed her eyes. In 30 seconds, she was asleep. In another 30, her breathing had evened out completely, as if the alley had never happened, as if she were someone who could simply put things down when she was done with them. Lucas suspected she couldn't. He suspected she just got very good at looking like she could. He stood in the doorway. Sarah was looking at the window. The black of 2 in the morning had begun, almost imperceptibly, to thin. She said without turning, "Thank you." 2 words, dry and even, the way she said everything. Lucas nodded once at the room, at the window, at nothing in particular, and pulled the door to and went back to the cot in the back room, and lay down in his clothes, and stared at the ceiling, and listened to the station breathe until sleep came back for him. Part 8. 3 days passed without incident. That was the word Lucas kept using in his head, incident, because it was a fire inspector's word, and it kept things at the right distance. No incident. No second visit from the compliance man. No movement at the gate that wasn't the team, Ron, Doran, Mace, cycling through shifts with the ordinary rhythm of people who had work to do and did it. Ron hadn't mentioned the footprints again. He brought an extra portion of stew from the kitchen alcove one evening and left it on the back room shelf without comment. and Lucas had taken it to the utility room and not said anything about it to anyone, and Ron had not asked. The three of them had settled into the utility room the way people settled into difficult spaces when they had no better option. Not comfortably, but practically. Yi had reorganized the chemical canisters by size along the far wall without being asked, which had given them another meter of floor space. Pest had finished his chalk drawing and started a second one. A row of small figures, round-headed, with lines coming off them like rays, each one slightly different from the last. Sarah had taken apart one of the spare pump fittings from the shelf, a corroded elbow joint that had been sitting there for years awaiting disposal, and was cleaning it with a strip of her torn sleeve and a technique that suggested she could have done it in the dark. Lucas watched her do this for a while on the evening of the third day. He'd come in with bread and a tin of salt fish, and she was sitting cross-legged on the mattress with the joint in her lap and the strip of cloth moving over it in slow, methodical circles. The burn on her shoulder was healing. The skin at the edges had gone from raw pink to the dull rose of tissue closing over itself, and she'd stopped unconsciously adjusting her position to protect it, which was the clearest sign he had. "You don't have to do that," he said. She looked at the joint. "It's corroded." "It's been corroded for 2 years." She kept cleaning it. "Then someone should have done this 2 years ago." He sat on the upturned crate and opened the tin of fish and set it on the floor between them. Yi took a piece without looking up from the knot she was working out of one of her bootlaces. Pest crawled over from his drawing and took a piece and crawled back. Sarah took one, ate it, kept working the cloth over the joint. After a while, she set the cloth down. She looked at the joint, cleaned now, the metal showing through, and set it on the shelf and looked at her hands. She had mechanic's hands, broad across the palm, with the particular callus pattern of someone who worked with tools that required sustained grip. She had a scar across 3 knuckles of her right hand that Lucas had noticed on the first night and hadn't asked about. She said, "I have the documents." Lucas looked at her. She reached down to the hem of her overalls, the left leg below the knee, and worked the fabric with her fingers until a seam separated. Not torn. It had been opened deliberately at some earlier point and reclosed in a way that looked intact until you knew to look for it. She reached inside and drew out a folded packet, dense and flat, perhaps 20 sheets of paper compressed and wrapped in a strip of oilcloth. She set it on the mattress between them. Lucas didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at it. The oilcloth was worn at the edges, carried for a long time, handled many times. The surface darkened with the particular grime of being close to a body through heat and cold and work. He thought about what it meant to carry something like this in the lining of your clothing for 2 years. Not as a metaphor. Practically, the weight of it against your leg through every shift, every day, every fire, sewn into the hem so it wouldn't shift. He picked it up and unfolded the oilcloth and opened the papers. They were not clean. They were not official records or printed reports. They were handwritten logs, carbon copies of internal shift reports, a folded schematic that had been drawn in pencil and then traced over in ink. Some of the pages had brown at the edges from heat, and one had a water stain across the lower third that had blurred the ink but not destroyed it. Lucas turned through them slowly. The logs were shift records from Halleck's original plant, the one that had burned 2 years ago, in Sarah's handwriting, which was small and even and showed the influence of someone who'd learned to write in conditions where paper was limited. The chemical storage quantities, recorded daily for 6 weeks before the fire. The sprinkler inspection dates and the name of the foreman who'd signed off on them, which was the same foreman currently working Peck's new facility. A copy of the internal maintenance request Sarah had filed 3 weeks before the fire. Accelerant storage repositioning, signed by her, stamped received, and the single-line response from management, also stamped, which said, "Deferred to next quarterly review." Lucas read that line twice. There was a folded letter at the back of the packet. He opened it. It was addressed to the City Labor Board in Sarah's hand dated 5 days before the fire. It listed the violations. It listed the previous maintenance request and the response. It requested urgent inspection. At the bottom, in different ink, a later edition. No response received as of, and then a date that was 2 days before the fire. He sat with the papers across his knees for a long time. The lamp burned on its cord. Yi had stopped working at her bootlace and was sitting with her arms around her knees, watching him. Pest had put down his chalk and was lying on his back on the mattress, looking at the ceiling with his gray eyes open. Sarah was watching Lucas's face, not his hands this time. His face. He understood why. What he did with his face in the next moment was going to tell her something she'd been waiting 2 years to know. Not about him specifically, but about whether it was possible in this city for the right people to see the right documents and do anything other than file them in the same drawer where all the other right documents had been filed. He'd seen her careful with hope before. He was watching her be careful with it now. He folded the papers back into the oilcloth. He did it slowly and precisely, the way he handled things he intended to keep intact. He held the packet for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Lighter than it should have been. For 2 years and 6 lives and a street full of ash. "I know a journalist," he said. "He's covered the District Labor Board for 4 years. He's been looking for something on PEC, the holding structure, the shell companies. But he hasn't been able to get inside the operational records." He looked at the packet. "This is inside." Sarah was quiet. The calculation behind her eyes was running, and he let it run, and didn't try to speed it up or steer it. "If you give these to a journalist," she said, "they become public." "Yes." "Peck will know where they came from." "He'll suspect. He won't be able to prove it without admitting what the documents show." Another silence. Yi had unfolded slightly. Her arms had loosened from around her knees, and she was watching Sarah with the careful attention of someone who knew better than to speak into this particular quiet. Sarah looked at the oilcloth packet in Lucas's hands. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Pest on the mattress, at his open gray eyes on the ceiling, at the chalk dust on his hand, at the small figures in a row on the stone floor behind him, each one with its lines like rays. He hadn't looked at any of them. He was watching the ceiling with the patience of a child who'd learned that the important things happened when adults thought he wasn't listening. Sarah looked back at Lucas. "How long have you known this journalist?" she said. 7 years. "Do you trust him?" Lucas thought about it, honestly. "I trust what he does with information. He doesn't protect sources. He publishes everything. It won't stay quiet." She nodded once, slow, deliberate, the nod of someone closing a door they'd been standing in front of for a long time. "Then you should go," she said, "before Peck sends someone else." Lucas looked down at the packet. He turned it once in his hands and then set it on the cot beside him, because he wasn't going anywhere tonight. Tonight, it needed to stay here, close and accounted for. And looked at Sarah and said, "In the morning." She nodded again. She picked up the strip of cloth from the shelf and the next corroded fitting from the pile she'd made and went back to work. Yi watched her for a moment. Then she looked at Lucas with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not the fast, bright surface of her usual face, but something underneath it, quieter and older. She didn't say anything. She just held it for a moment, and then looked away, and picked up her bootlace, and went back to the knot. Pest turned his head on the mattress and looked at Lucas. He looked at the oilcloth packet. He looked at Lucas again. Then he said, in the small, certain voice of a child who has been quiet for a very long time and has chosen this moment to spend the words, "It won't burn this time." No one answered him. The lamp burned. The city moved outside the window. Sarah's cloth moved over the fitting in slow, even circles, and the sound of it was the only sound in the room for a long time after. He left at first light before the shift change. The packet was inside his inspection coat, flat against his chest, held there by the wide leather strap that crossed over his sternum. He could feel it with every step. Not the weight, which was negligible, but the specific pressure of it, the way you felt a thing that mattered differently from a thing that didn't. He'd slept 3 hours. He'd woken at 5 and lain in the dark for a moment running through the route. Not because he didn't know it, but because going through it quietly in his head was the kind of preparation that didn't look like preparation and didn't cost anything. The journalist's name was Phil. He worked out of a narrow office above a print shop on the east side of the Market District, which was a 40-minute walk from the station through streets that were already beginning to fill with the early commerce of a working day. Carts, deliveries, the first factory shifts. Lucas walked at the pace of someone who had somewhere to be and no reason to hurry, which was faster than it looked. He'd sent no message ahead. Fell didn't have a wire in his office, a deliberate choice, he'd once explained, because wires made records, and records made vulnerabilities. And showing up unannounced was simply how you visited Fell when it mattered. Lucas had done it twice before. Once with a tip about the district water board that had gone nowhere because the source had recanted. Once with the name of the plant owner from 2 years ago, which had gone the same place the water board tip had gone. Which was the place where things went when they were true, but unprovable. This time he had proof. The print shop smelled like ink and paper, and the specific warmth of machinery that ran all day. He went up the stairs at the side and knocked on the door at the top. A long pause. Then the sound of movement, a chair scraping, boots on the floor, and Fell opened the door with the expression of a man who was always mildly surprised to find that the world hadn't waited for him to finish his coffee. He was tall and thin, Fell, with ink on his left hand that was never entirely gone, and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead that he never seemed to use for reading. He looked at Lucas. He looked at the coat. He stepped back from the door. Lucas came in and sat in the chair across from the desk and took the oilcloth packet from inside his coat and set it on the desk between them. Fell sat. He looked at the packet. He looked at Lucas. He picked it up and opened the oilcloth and began to read, and the office was quiet for a long time except for the sound of paper turning and the machinery below, and, distantly, the city going about its morning. Fell read everything twice. Lucas knew he read everything twice. It was the thing about him that made him worth trusting, that particular stubbornness of attention. When he was finished, he set the papers down and took the reading glasses off his forehead and put them on, which was unusual, and looked at the documents again through the lenses. "Peck," he said. "Peck," Lucas said. "The foreman's name is on the inspection sign-offs. And on the current facility's safety log. I have the dates from my inspection visit." Fell looked at him over the glasses. "You went in officially." "Officially." A pause. That was either very smart or very stupid. "I know what I found. It's in my ledger. It corroborates the maintenance log from 2 years ago." Fell put the glasses back on his forehead. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at the papers and then at Lucas. "Who carried these?" "That's not part of what I'm giving you." Fell held his gaze for a moment. He wasn't pushing. He was simply registering that there was a boundary there, and where it was. He'd always been good at that. "How long do I have before Peck knows they're out?" "He already suspects something. He sent a compliance man to the station 3 days ago." Fell was quiet. He picked up the folded letter, the one to the labor board, the one with the date and the single line, "No response received," and looked at it. He held it carefully, the way Lucas had held the whole packet when Sarah had put it in his hands, feeling the specific weight of a thing that had been carried for 2 years sewn into someone's clothing. "I can have something ready in 4 days," Fell said. "If I move on it now." I have a contact at the district records office who can verify the company registration trail." 4 days, Lucas said. 3 if the contact comes through today. Lucas nodded. He stood. He picked up the oilcloth and folded it and put it back inside his coat, because the document stayed with him until Fell had made copies, and Fell knew that, and was already pulling a stack of blank paper from his desk drawer. He was halfway down the stairs when he heard it. Not a sound, exactly, more the absence of one, the way a street that should have had ambient noise suddenly didn't. He stopped on the stairs and listened. The print shop machinery below, the street outside, and then footsteps, more than one set, coming toward the building from the direction he'd come from. He went back up the stairs and put his head through the door. "Is there another way out?" Fell looked up. He'd already moved the documents to the inside of his own coat. He pointed to the window at the back of the office. "Print shop roof, then the alley." Lucas went to the window, checked the drop, decided against it. He was 40 minutes from the station, and the documents were in Fell's coat and the copies weren't made yet, and running now would confirm what he was running from. He went back down the stairs and out the print shop door and onto the street and turned to face what was coming. There were 4 of them. Not the compliance man. These were different, broader, with a particular walk of men who'd been told that this time words weren't the primary tool. They stopped when they saw him outside the door. Not surprised. They'd known he was there, which meant they'd followed him from the station, which meant they'd been watching the station since before this morning. Lucas stood at the print shop door and looked at the 4 of them and felt the familiar flat settling that came over him in situations that had already moved past the point of prevention. The same settling he felt walking into a burning building, where the fire was already what it was, and the only question was how you moved through it. The one at the front said, "You should come with us." "Should I?" Lucas said. He didn't move. He stood with his weight balanced and his hands at his sides and looked at the 4 men and thought about the documents inside Fell's coat, and the 40 minutes back to the station and the 4 of them between him and both of those things, and he didn't move. Then he heard a footstep behind him. He didn't turn. He knew the footstep. He'd been listening to it for 4 years on station floors, on yardstones, on the wet cobblestones after a call. Ron stepped up beside him. He'd come from the direction of the market, his hands in his coat pockets, his broad face arranged in the expression of someone who'd simply happened to be in the vicinity and had stopped to see what the situation was. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. Lucas heard another footstep, then another. He turned slightly. Mace had come from the other direction, from the street that ran behind the print shop, with his helmet still in his hand from the shift he'd apparently just left. He stopped on Lucas's other side. He looked at the 4 men. He didn't say anything either. The 4 men looked at Ron, at Mace, at Lucas, at the print shop door. The calculation on their faces was visible. Not fear, nothing so direct as that, but the specific reassessment of men who had been sent with a clear task and had arrived to find the task was no longer clear. The one at the front looked at Lucas for a long moment. Then he turned and walked. The other 3 followed. Lucas stood on the pavement between Ron and Mace and watched them go. The street filled back up with its ordinary sounds. Carts, voices, the machinery of the print shop, the city not stopping for any of this. Ron took his hands out of his pockets. Mace put his helmet on, which he always did when he didn't know what else to do with his hands. "You followed me," Lucas said. "We came for coffee," Ron said. He looked at the print shop. "There's no coffee here, apparently." Lucas looked at him. Ron's face gave nothing. Mace was looking at the corner where the 4 men had gone, with the expression of someone filing away information he might need later. "Ron," Lucas said. "The footprints," Ron said quietly. I've been doing this job for 16 years. I know what footprints mean." He paused. "I know what that fire meant 2 years ago. We all do." He looked at Lucas steadily. "We just didn't know someone had kept the paperwork." Lucas held his gaze. There was nothing to say to that would be the right size. So he said nothing. They walked back to the station together, the three of them, through the morning streets, and no one came after them. The article ran on the 4th day. Fell had moved fast, faster than 3 days, faster than 4. He'd gotten his contact at the district records office on the first afternoon, and the company registration trail had unraveled cleanly, the way things unraveled when someone finally pulled the right thread. Peck's holding structure, the shell company, the original Halleck plant registered under a subsidiary that shared a director with the new facility on Cutter North, the foreman's name on both sets of safety documentation. The maintenance request from 2 years ago, stamped received, answered with a deferral. The letter to the labor board with its date and its silence. Lucas read the article at the station in the morning, standing at the boardroom table with the paper flat in front of him and his coffee going cold beside it. Fell had written it the way Fell wrote everything, without drama, just the facts in sequence, each one placed where it needed to be so the shape of the thing was visible without anyone having to explain the shape. It was enough. It was more than enough. Lucas read it twice and folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket and went to the utility room and knocked. Sarah opened the door. She'd heard him coming. She always heard him coming, the particular quality of his step on the corridor stone apparently distinguishable from everything else that moved through the building. She looked at his face and read whatever was in it and stepped back to let him in. He took the paper from his pocket and held it out. She took it and read it standing, with the same stillness she brought to everything. The methodical turn of the page, the eyes moving steadily down the column. Yi came to read over her shoulder, which involved bending significantly, and read faster, and by the time Sarah reached the bottom, Yi had finished and was standing with both hands pressed flat over her mouth. Sarah folded the paper. She held it for a moment. Then she set it on the shelf beside the cleaned pump fittings and looked at the wall. Pest was sitting by his drawings, which now covered most of the floor space he could reach from the mattress. Rows of small round figures with their radiating lines, a city of them in chalk on the station stone. He hadn't looked up when Lucas came in. He looked up now, at Sarah's face, and then at Lucas, and then went back to his drawing without comment. Peck was charged this morning, Lucas said. The district prosecutor's office. Fell had them on the article before it ran. They'd been building a file on the shell structure for 2 years, but didn't have the operational documentation. He paused. They have it now. Sarah nodded, once. It's not finished, he said, because she needed to know that, and he wasn't going to dress it as something cleaner than it was. The charge takes time. There'll be hearings. He has lawyers, good ones. But the documents are in public record now. They can't be unfiled. I know how it works, Sarah said, not sharply, just accurately. He nodded. He did know she knew. He'd said it anyway because saying it was part of not pretending. Yi had taken her hands from her mouth. She was looking at the paper on the shelf with an expression that was trying to contain something too large for the room, something that had been compressed for 2 years into the space behind her ribs and was now, incrementally, releasing. Her eyes were bright. She wasn't going to cry. He didn't think she was someone who cried easily, or perhaps at all. But whatever the thing was that was releasing, it was visible in the quality of her stillness, which was new. Yi was never still. They left before dawn the next morning. Lucas had known it was coming. Sarah had told him 2 days earlier, quietly, while Yi was asleep and Pest was sitting in his corner with the chalk. She'd said, when the article runs, we move. Not because the station wasn't safe, but because safety wasn't a permanent condition, and she'd learned not to treat it as one. They needed to be somewhere the connection between them and the documents couldn't be followed and used. Lucas had nodded and not argued, because she was right and he knew she was right, and because arguing would have meant asking them to stay for reasons that were his rather than theirs. He walked them to the turnoff at the end of the industrial block, the point where the station's street met the wider road that ran north out of the district, toward the part of the city that thinned into smaller buildings and eventually into something that wasn't city anymore. The sky was the color of ash going cold, not yet light, with the smoke from the night shift stacks hanging flat above the roofline. His breath showed in the air. So did theirs. Yi walked beside him for most of the block. She talked. She'd been talking since they'd left the utility room, a steady, low stream of it, not nervous this time, but something different. The talking of someone filling a space before it became a silence she'd have to carry. She talked about the cleaned pump fittings which she'd left stacked on the shelf. She talked about the chalk drawings which Pest had looked at for a long time before leaving them on the floor, apparently satisfied that they were finished. She talked about the boots of different colors she was wearing, and how she'd found the left one near the gate of the old plant the morning after the fire, and the right one she'd had for 3 years before that, and they were nearly the same size. At the corner, she stopped talking. She turned to Lucas and looked at him for a moment, the full inventory, one last time, and then stepped forward and put her arms around him. She was tall enough that his chin fit against her shoulder, which was not a configuration he'd expected. She held on for a count of 3, and then stepped back and picked up her bag and kept walking without looking back, which he understood was the only way she was going to manage it. Pest walked past him next. He stopped and looked up at Lucas with his gray eyes, direct and serious in the way he looked at things that mattered. Then he reached out and put his small hand flat on Lucas's wrist, just for a moment, just the pressure of it, and walked on after Yi. Sarah stopped last. She stood in front of him, and he stood in front of her, and the sky was lightening imperceptibly above the roofline, and neither of them said anything, because what there was between them had been built out of doors opened in the dark, and mugs of water, and documents sewn into a hem, and a man walking past a door without hesitating, and none of that translated into words that were the right size. She reached up with her right hand and unclasped the bracelet from her wrist, the copper wire with the small gears worn to a shine at the clasp from long handling. She set it on the iron railing at the corner, set it there precisely, deliberately, the way you placed a tool when you were done with it and someone else might need it. Then she turned and walked. She didn't look back. She walked the way she did everything, straight, without adjustment, as if the direction she'd chosen was the only one that had ever existed. Lucas watched the 3 of them reach the bend in the road, and Yi's asymmetric hair above the line of her collar, and Pest's small figure between them, and then the bend took them, and the road was empty. He stood at the railing. The bracelet was on the iron, the copper dark against the gray paint, the small gears catching nothing in the flat pre-dawn light. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that the sky shifted by a degree. Not dawn, not yet, just the city deciding that night was finished with it. Somewhere behind him a factory whistle started the first shift. Smoke rose in a straight column from a stack 2 streets over and then bent at the top where the wind caught it, heading north. He picked up the bracelet. It was lighter than it looked. The wire was warm from her wrist. He turned it once in his fingers and felt the small gears, each one catching on the next, and stood at the corner of the empty road with the city starting up around him and the smoke going north and the bracelet in his palm. He didn't put it on. Not yet. He closed his hand around it and stood there a moment more, listening to the city fill with its ordinary sounds, and then turned and walked back toward the station. There's something I keep thinking about. Sarah carried those documents for 2 years, not as evidence, not as a plan, just because putting them down would have meant accepting that no one was coming. And Lucas picked them up, not because he was certain it would work, but because he couldn't put them down either. If this story found you, if any part of it landed somewhere real, leave a like or a comment or just a word. It helps the next person find it. And if you want to know what happens in the next story from this world, subscribe. The gates open